Hey, this is part of a video diary I'm making in response to Nobody's Girl by Virginia Giuffre. My comments are driven by a lifelong study, I started when I was like 12, of psychology, kind of obsessive because I was trying to heal myself, and a personal history of CSA. So I comment on what she experienced, and I also comment on what I experienced and the psychological roots of all of that to help people better understand the topic and help people who have gone through it feel a little bit less alone. This particular part will cover chapters 8, 9, and 10. A familiar emptiness flooded me. Just minutes before, I had arrived at Epstein's mansion hoping that I was turning a corner. Now I knew I was right back where I'd worked so hard not to be. How many times had I put my faith in someone only to be hurt and humiliated? But this time, the disappointment was excruciating. I blamed myself. Is sex all anyone will ever want from me? A voice inside me shrieked, as another, harsher voice chided, "Yes, you idiot! You knew that already!" I tasted the tang of adrenaline in my mouth, and I could feel my brain begin to shut down. My body couldn't escape from this room, but my mind couldn't bear to stay, so it put me on a kind of autopilot, submissive and determined to survive. So in this passage, we see some of what we discussed in the last video, which is about only being valued for sex, and coming to the conclusion that yes, you will only be valued for that purpose, and you know that, you learned it in childhood. But she also talks about going into autopilot, the instinctive, the learned and eventually ingrained response of going into submissive mode to survive the encounter. I know for me, this, and I think she talks about this at a later point, it involved a lot of dissociation. I remember literally thinking that you can hurt my body, but you can't hurt me. Which wasn't true at all. You can't divide yourself that way. You can just ignore what's going on, but ignoring things doesn't make them go away. For some people it might, and it's awesome if it does. But for me, it really didn't. Too much of the deep brain limbic system got trained by the experience, carried the trauma around, and it influenced everything, especially when I ignored it. But what she's particularly discussing here is the fawn response, which is now known to be one of the possible PTSD response. You get fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. This is the fawn response. It's when you basically make people feel good, hoping that they will decide not to hurt you as much, which does sometimes work. All of them work sometimes and not all the time, which is part of why they're unhelpful to have as automatic responses rather than active choices that we make deliberately. But when you go through repeated trauma, things get ingrained. But yeah, I felt that passage. Felt a little too hard. I spent a shocking amount of my life that way. I didn't just do it in the context of physical intimacy. I eventually learned to take that back for myself in consensual encounters, even though I still thought was the only reason people thought I was valuable. But I did it in every other area of life where I still felt valueless. If I could just listen to what people tell me to do, if I just did what they wanted, maybe they wouldn't hate me, maybe they wouldn't hurt me, maybe they wouldn't insult me as much. It didn't work. But I guess I shouldn't be surprised. It's the fight or flight response. That kind of emotional, amped up reactivity is not adapted to genuinely connecting with anyone. It's not a way to live your daily life, even though I tried. Right after Virginia's first encounter with Epstein, then Epstein led the way to the steam room, where he told me to rub his feet. As I did so, kneeling before him, he lectured me about the history of sweat lodges and how opening the pores allows toxins to leave the body. It was important to make healthy decisions, he said, adding, "I can teach you so many things." From that first meeting, Epstein wanted me to regard him as a mentor, not a predator. And I will say that in conflict to what Eppinger told her in the last video, this is an improvement. He's certainly teaching her about physical intimacy, but he's suggesting that there's more to that in life, that it is good to learn and do things aside from that, that other things than that matter. Epstein is a monster, but at this point I started to understand how she could have been drawn into his web relatively readily. Not only did he pay well, but he was also showing a kind of superficial, self-serving respect for her as a person. And I can tell you from my own experience that when you've been treated poorly for long enough by enough people, even the slightest show of that, even shows like Epstein was doing that are largely just to enforce his rules of life and to make himself look refined and intelligent and like a good mentor, that feels like love because it is active guidance. It's self-serving guidance. It's there to bolster the person's ego as well as control your behavior. But it feels like love because it offers the guidance you never had before. Guidance feels like care because it is an important part of care. Healthy guidance teaches you to make your own decisions. Epstein isn't doing that. I don't even know if he's pretending to do that. He wants people to live the way he lives. But it's still a step up from what she had. I had something very similar with my longest relationship. He seemed very wise, very knowledgeable. He understood people. He knew etiquette. He could actually read facial expressions. Yes, I know that's normal, but it's impressive from my point of view. And I really admired that. He talked himself up. He pretended he knew and could do more and was more right than he was. But I was so desperate for guidance that I was quite happy to listen to everything. And this despite the fact that what he was actually teaching me was white supremacy. Yeah. The person who as a young child only really made friends with the Asian kids and the Middle Eastern kids was being taught white supremacy and going, well, this person cares about me. They're actually helping me. They may not be right about everything, but they're right about a lot. I need to at least respect that he's allowed to have different opinions on these sorts of issues. You don't need to respect white supremacy. You don't. Not even if the person is being nicer to you than most people. It's okay. But I do think that we were both drawn to this aspect in both of the men who trapped us for long periods of time. And it was our pre-existing vulnerability, the neglect in our past, that made that possible. Alright, after leaving Epstein's house, she says, having escaped from an imminent threat, my brain came back online, but all it wanted to do was scream. During the half-hour drive into Loxahatchee, Alessi and I didn't speak. If I opened my mouth, I knew I'd just start sobbing, so I clamped my lips shut. I didn't know then what a therapist would tell me a decade later, that when children are abused by people they love, as I had been by my father, they start to believe that love and pain, love and betrayal, love and violation all go together. I didn't know that these victims struggle to see red flags because they've become desensitized to inappropriate behavior. I didn't know that a common coping mechanism during abuse is to distance oneself from what is happening in the moment, to split into parts, the obedient body and the walled-off mind. All I knew as the black suburban headed west was that I felt gutted, as if someone had reached down my throat and scooped out my insides with a silver spoon. Okay, there's a lot to unpack here. It took me a long time to learn a lot of these things too, and I don't think they're... I actually talked about the love and pain being coupled in the last video. You can go back and see that. You can't readily see red flags even when they're right in front of you because you've normalized the behavior. I still normalize a lot of really red flag behavior. My partner and I were recently watching the newer Dexter series. The one set in a rural town in New York in particular had a kid drawing really gory things in his notebook, and I was completely unfazed. That seemed totally normal to me. My partner was saying something along the lines of, oh, don't let it go that way. And I was just like, What's strange about having really gory drawings of people you know in your notebook? This looks totally ordinary to me. And he had to explain that he clearly had very obvious mental problems. And I was just like, I had no idea. So I still haven't learned to spot all the red flags. In fact, a lot of them seem actively comforting to me. They seem honest, they seem real, they seem genuine. Not some fantasy that's unattainable and I'll fail to get to even if I try, and fail to keep even if I get to it. Yeah, it screws you up so much. But logically, I know better, and I definitely choose different behaviors, different company, and it's made a world of difference in my life. I cannot recommend it more highly. We also talked about the dissociation earlier, but I also wanted to talk about having the walled-off mind. You can also have walled-off emotions, which I think is probably included in mind for her since she's contrasting it to the body. I still have trouble connecting to anyone at all. I have no problem talking and writing about my experiences, but I don't even know what my emotions are most of the time. And I certainly am not comfortable communicating them. Trying to tap into my own needs, also extremely difficult. But I do try to do things that will make people happier, make their lives flow more easily, and I get a lot of satisfaction out of doing that in a healthy way, as opposed to the unhealthy way that I did it when I was younger. The lesson that I can feel loved and make others feel loved by doing things for them was not wrong, but it needs to be motivated by love and not fear if it's going to be healthy. Alright, Chapter 9, Tapping a Crooked Vein. When I met Epstein just before my 17th birthday, all I wanted was to learn a skill that would give me the means to live an independent life. At least, that's what I told myself. With hindsight, though, the grown-up me can see that the teenage me also wanted something else. What had Epstein said that first night? That I was a keeper? By now you know how long I'd hoped to hear words like those and to believe I was worth keeping. She continues this theme on page 82 in the same chapter. As I became a regular at Epstein's house, it was difficult to avoid the demeaning nature of this transactional relationship. Epstein took delight in explaining to me, for example, that he had painted his house pink because I love pink. Pink is for pussy. But so many of my connections to men had been humiliating that I think I saw this one as a challenge. Maybe, for once, I thought, I could make it work for me. This only makes sense, of course, when you consider how little I'd grown up hoping for. As Epstein used me to satisfy his perverse appetites, I rationalized that perhaps he might also help me to better myself. If he and Maxwell made good on their promise to get me trained as a masseuse, perhaps that would set me on a path to freedom and prosperity. I told myself it was worth the gamble. She hits on a really important point there, which is our early treatment does a lot to set our expectations in life. A lot of people look at abuse victims, especially adult victims, and say, why did she stay? They always say she, even though this happens to men as well, especially if we take emotional abuse seriously, and we should. It happens just as often to men. And we think, why'd they stay? I wouldn't tolerate that. If you wouldn't tolerate that, either you've learned to respect yourself, you've learned you can do better, or you were taught that growing up. She, and I, was taught that that isn't for you. That's not accessible to you. You are valuable for this reason, and this reason only. You cannot hope for more. So having someone point her towards ways to improve herself, having someone help her improve herself in ways that she chose, would have been revolutionary. I don't even think it's the way that she went for this. I think it's remarkably ambitious because she is aiming at going for the career she wants that she couldn't actually figure out how to get to without their intervention earlier. She was already learning a little bit from people, but I don't think she knew how she would pay for the school, how to really move it forward. This streamlined that process, provided they even made half good on their promises. And given the way that Epstein styled himself as a mentor and her naivety at the time, a naivety I remember being and having myself when I was being enculturated into something I never actually believed, but okay. But I'm just saying it's not as weird as you might think. We do what we're conditioned to do. We do what we're trained to do. We react in ways that we think will preserve our lives in response to the threats and the abilities that we see in the world and ourselves. People raised like she and I were, we don't think there's much, if anything, of worth in us by default. We may or may not believe we're trainable. I did. She did, at least as far as being a masseuse goes. But you always worry that you can't do it on your own, so having help from someone else, that's incredibly tempting. Especially someone else who's paying you well, who's treating you with some respect, even if there's also demeaning stuff in there. It feels worth the cost, worth the pain, so you take it, and you hope it goes better than you fear it might. Chapter 9 also shows one of Epstein's more coercive ways of trying to keep his employees under his thumb. Early on, she thought it was probably foolish to rely on someone who throws people away very readily. But that's when Epstein came in with more manipulation to make sure she complied. He picked up a grainy photograph and handed it to me. The image had been taken from some distance, but it was unmistakably my little brother. Skadi was walking away from the camera. I could see his backpack and the outline of the side of his face. I felt a stab of fear. Why did Epstein have a photo of the person I loved most in the world? "We know where your brother goes to school," Epstein said. He let that sink in for a moment, then got to the point. "You must never tell a soul what goes on in this house." He was smiling, but his threat was clear. Should I ever be tempted to betray him and go to the authorities, he would hurt Skadi. I stared at him. He stared back. "And I own the Palm Beach Police Department," he said, "so they won't do anything about it." This is a level of terror I never had to deal with, because no one who hurt me had any appreciable amount of power. This man, he did. He had money, he had influence, he had friends in very high places. It's difficult for me to even imagine how hard it would have been to not be completely terrified, to think that you could get away without catastrophic damage coming to you and following you for the rest of your life. But of course, I did love people. As I discussed in the first video, my mother's life was threatened by one of the people who abused me. And oh yeah, I forgot, my long-term abuser also threatened to come to my farm, which I knew he had found the location of, and kill my entire family if I didn't stay with him and not tell anyone about the bad stuff. It's funny the things you forget. I'm just saying this is not actually that weird of a threat, but having it come from someone that powerful, someone who could do it with little or no repercussions, that's impressive. The thing that mostly made me hesitate when I was threatened wasn't the power of the person, it was the fact that they didn't think their life or themselves were worth anything, so they wouldn't actually be throwing anything away by getting caught, even being executed. They would have been fine with it. It would have just made the pain stop earlier. People with nothing to lose are not as dangerous as incredibly powerful and evil people, but it's close. Next is Chapter 10, A Very Important Man. It's taken me a long time to understand that Epstein and Maxwell solidified their power over me by offering me a new sort of family. Epstein was the patriarch, Maxwell the matriarch, and these rules were not merely implied. Maxwell liked to call the girls who regularly serviced Epstein her children. She and Epstein once took me to a boat show in Palm Beach and spent the afternoon introducing me as their daughter, just for kicks. As bizarre as that sounds, it felt kind of good to me. Less good, given my history, was that Epstein sometimes insisted that I call him daddy during sex. While I was hardly equipped to judge, it often seemed to me that Epstein and Maxwell behaved like actual parents. And she goes on to describe instances of them doing things like correcting her table manners. And I got a lot of that from my ex, whose guidance I liked as well. I understand how comforting it felt. I understand why she was drawn to it. I understand why it was reassuring. It was, however, just control. Just making sure she couldn't think or act or do anything they didn't previously approve and script for her. Also, why my partner did it. But when you don't have that solid parenting growing up, when you have neglect and abuse and not much else. You grow up not knowing how to comport yourself and very self-conscious about the fact that you don't know how to comport yourself. So someone providing you that guidance, helping you fit into polished, ordinary situations without feeling out of place and completely unaware of what you should do, it makes the person feel like home. It makes you feel loved. Being controlled can and does feel like love to people who grow up this way. Let's move on. Page 95, same chapter, chapter 10. Epstein continued to cast himself as my mentor. Sometimes we'd sit in his steam shower for hours as he held forth on topics I'd never heard of before. Game theory, say, or evolutionary biology, financial derivatives, or the mathematical underpinnings of human language. He also gave me books to read. Many of them were sexual in nature, such as Nabokov's Lolita and Anne Desclose's Story of O. Sorry, I read that recently, so I'm a little bit shocked. But his insistence that I read them still felt like a vote of confidence. Frequently, Epstein told me something I needed to hear, that I was smart and full of potential. I had two exes like this, and I liked them both for that same level of guidance and the potential they saw in me because of their desire to expend the energy to guide me. I loved when their eyes lit up, when I recognized something, when I could parry back with similar works of literature or political or sociological information. I loved that they appreciated and recognized my references, my allusions, my sources, and could feed me more and help me develop the ideas. Even when someone was expounding upon something I didn't know anything about, which was very common with my first ex, like this in particular, I saw it as them investing in me, not just trying to make themselves look grand and smart and incomparable, and therefore better than anyone else I would get in any capacity and worth any sacrifice I would need to pay. I eventually learned that this kind of behavior is often a mask for deep felt inadequacy. Being an intellectual or even a pseudo-intellectual is a way of covering up for the deficits of character and temperament, for the lack of interest outside of academics. It's a way to feel big, brilliant, when inside you feel very, very small, very, very worthless, and very small in the world. Oh, it's narcissism. It's narcissism. Okay. Ultimately, it's a childishness. It's a need to show off because you don't think you're actually worth very much. A need for stimulation can also, but does not necessarily accompany that. It certainly seemed to be there in Epstein's case. You want to show that your mind is very good, but you also want to get out of your mind. You use whatever means seem appropriate to you to accomplish that. All of it avoids processing whatever's really going on in the depths and becoming the good and virtuous and helpful and genuinely engaging, genuinely loving person who really wants to know someone. You will just mold people into what you want instead of really engaging them as they are, loving them as they are, and being loved in return for more than just what you can help them with, for who you are, what you feel, what you've been through, your nature, your soul. It's a proxy, this being the wise mentor. It's a way of hiding. You never have to connect if you can just talk about what you know instead. On the next page, she speculates about exactly what I just talked about. I was mostly talking about my ex, but she seems to have seen the same in Epstein. While I have no evidence to prove it, I think it's also possible that in me, an abused child, Epstein saw a bit of himself. Only once did I question him about his experiences growing up. I knew him well enough not to directly ask, "Were you ever abused as a kid. Instead, I carefully inquired whether he'd had a happy upbringing. Sensing where I was heading, I think, he cut me off almost before I finished my question, making clear that was a topic I should never raise again. Maybe I'm wrong, but I've always believed that during his own childhood he'd experienced some kind of. If that is true, it doesn't lessen the awfulness of Epstein's crimes, but it may help explain them. I know that Epstein was emotionally broken, devoid of any ability to form deep connections to others, but whether he was born that way or was abused in a manner that eroded his capacity for empathy, no one will probably ever know. So this actually happens a lot. The cliche term is hurt people, but people who endured sexual mistreatment in childhood often do grow up to mistreat people, especially this rapacious appetite she reports in Epstein. Hypersexuality also is linked to being abused in childhood. I know once I resolved a lot of my PTSD surrounding my childhood, my sex drive plummeted. Before that, I was voracious and constantly so, and very much enjoyed all of it. But once the trauma was resolved, I didn't need it anymore. I was happy and connected to my emotions without it. I was able to feel the presence of God without it, which had never been the case before because I was divided from the world and from myself. I lived in a kind of limbo created by the abuse. It's very, very common to seek out stimulation, whether through chemistry or physical touch, or even just loud, blasting music, which I also use to cope when that's where you come from. Part of it is a desire to connect with what's going on inside of us, with the world, but not knowing any other way to do it. And part of it is a desperate need for a distraction from what we don't ever want to remember or think about again. Like her, I can't begin to speculate about Epstein, but it holds true for a lot of the people I've known, including people who have hurt me. Monsters. Some of them are born, but most of them are made. All right. That's all for this particular episode. You can come back for more later, but that's all I'm gonna do today. Do what thou wilt, shall be the whole of the law. Love is the law, love under will.